All right, well, welcome to Chapter 6. We're going to be looking at some problems that we see in modern policing, and we're going to look at some of the solutions that are offered. So let's go ahead and jump in. Again, like almost all chapters, I'd like to start off asking you to ask questions yourself before you start. So one of the things we're going to talk about is discretion. We're going to talk about, where discretion should exist inside the system. Do you let police officers make a decision to arrest someone or not to arrest someone? And if you say, well, if you give them the authority, just let them arrest everybody, is that a workable system? Does it mean that discretion ceases to exist? Does it go somewhere else in the system? And again, we go back, I think, to the paramilitary model, the model of policing as a military force, and its antecedents in history. DNA evidence, we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about exonerations and what does this have to say about the entire system. I think that's a fair question. Are you recruiting particular candidates for particular reasons? Is that a solution to something? And if not, why? And I think one of the fundamental ones, this comes at the very end, is when we start talking about getting getting people to act more ethically. This presupposes you can teach people ethics, that this is a learnable skill. And this goes with morality, of course, and I think this is a good question. How do you teach ethics? Can you teach ethics? Simply because you say you can do something doesn't really mean you can do it. All right, let's jump in. Because one of the things I talked about was discretion, and discretion is, quite simply, making a decision when faced with choices. You exercise discretion. So consider a police officer who's walking his beat, and he sees three people commit a crime at approximately the same time. You have one person who is jaywalking, okay, and he might be not paying attention to his phone, and he walks across the street and he commits an infraction. And then the police officer sees someone light up a joint, and he smells the marijuana, but he can see that this person has a debilitating disease, that he is crippled and in a wheelchair. And the third person he sees commits a crime is someone that hits someone else in the chest really hard and hits and strikes him in a violent manner. So my question to you would be, since he can only arrest one of these people, he can only engage with one of them immediately, which one do you want to go after? And if you're going to say, okay, well, I mean, it's pretty obvious the person that strikes the other person is the worst crime, you're exercising discretion at that point. You're saying the police officer can put those crimes in order, saying, okay, jaywalking is the least serious, drugs is maybe second, but the most serious is the assault. So the police officer goes up to the victim and the perpetrator, and the guy said, oh, no, I was choking, and he hit me and it dislodged food that was in my esophagus, and he saved my life. So when the police officer goes up to arrest him, let's suppose he puts the handcuffs on him before he gets the explanation out of the victim. He arrests him, in other words, he brings him into custody. He made a discretionary decision, which I assume, given those three options I gave you, you all pretty much went along with and said yes, but it turned out to be the wrong decision. It is in the nature of human interaction, and the police do a lot of human interaction, that people are going to make mistakes. Now, when police officers make mistakes, minor ones like this, well, I mean, he can apologize, take the handcuffs off, let him go. But suppose the police officer drew a gun. Suppose the police officer tackled a person. Mistakes that police officers make can have profound, even fatal results. Okay. We do assume, going into talking about the police, that the police are honest and trustworthy, that we can rely upon them to, when they exercise discretion, to make good decisions. And we are going to assume here that they have experience and they have training, and it makes them the best judge of a situation at the moment. The police have wide familiarity with human behavior, and the police, of course, are in some danger themselves, and they need to be able to act to prevent harm and death of others and of themselves and of a larger society. Now, there's a lot of assumptions built into this discretionary system that we're discussing here. And, obviously you might say, well, I don't think the police are honest and trustworthy. You might start at the very base one. Or you might say, well, I don't think they're very well trained, or I don't think they have good experience, or I don't think they actually have exposure to human behavior, or I don't think they face a particularly dangerous job compared to some other professions. All of these assumptions that your book gives, I think, are things that could be discussed, things that could be analyzed. Let's just take one of the ones that seems less contentious, that they have familiarity with human behavior. Does a beat officer, a police officer, really have the skills necessary to deal with human behavior? And you're probably saying, well, yeah, probably so. But remember in the previous chapter I talked about mental health. I talked about how with deinstitutionalization there's a lot of mentally ill people in the street. Well, for many small police departments and even some medium-sized police departments, there's very little training to deal with the mentally ill. So you might have a police officer who comes into a situation and he is dealing with someone that has a mental illness, let's just say schizophrenia. And he might have no or little familiarity with the disease. He might have the wrong assumptions about the disease. He might have, a lower level. So when you say wide familiarity, we're kind of assuming that previous one, that they have experience and training. And, a fair question would be, do they indeed? And does this lead to this familiarity of human behavior? What are we expecting them to do versus, and here's the important point of discretion, what tools are we giving them? Okay, there are a few elements of discretion, and this goes back to much of what we were talking about when I gave you that example of the three people, the jaywalker, the person smoking dope, and the person hitting another person. Is the first thing we often ask about discretion is, how serious is the situation when the cop made the decision? Was it a life or death situation? Was it a very minor situation? Was it somewhere in between? What is the attitude of the person in the encounter? So let's suppose the cop comes up to the jaywalker and says, hey, just so you know, that was pretty dangerous. You were looking down at your phone, you crossed the street, you could have caused an accident, you yourself could have been hurt. And the cop is ready at that point to give him a little bit of criticism for it, but let him go. And the pedestrian gets irate and starts shouting at the cop and starts cursing at him, saying, I'm so tired of the cops, harassing me, and I hate them, and, you're all a bunch of pigs, and, just spouts vitriol at the cop. Well, at that point, don't you think that the cop, being a human being, is going to act in a reaction? He might have not intended to write a ticket, we'll say, but would write one. What is the relationship between the offender and the victim? So this goes back to our example I gave about punching someone in the chest. We're going to say, if the victim said, yeah, I was just walking down the street and this guy hit me in the chest, that's a hostile relationship. So the discretion that's going to be exercised there is the police officer is going to be on the side of the victim. Conversely, if the offender says, hey, this guy was choking to death and I came up and I didn't have time to get around and give him a Heimlich, so I punched him in his solar plexus in hope of triggering a gag reflex, and when that didn't work, I was getting ready to slide around and give him a a Heimlich maneuver when you stopped me. So the relationship of offender and victim, and this sometimes goes to, is the victim sympathetic? Is the victim believable? Is the offender sympathetic? Is it someone that we expect? I was watching the news last night, and some police officers and some paramedics were charged with a crime, I believe. They were certainly sued, where a man was walking home from a convenience store. He was wearing a mask. He suffered from anxiety, and the police officer stopped him and questioned him. Now, they had no probable cause for arrest, but he kept saying, I'm not comfortable not wearing a mask. And this is pre-COVID, and didn't act respectful. And eventually what happened was they tackled him. They took him to the ground, and the paramedics, the EMTs, administered ketamine, which is a tranquilizer. Originally came over, I believe, from veterinary medicine. And he dies. So, a fair question would be, well, what's departmental policy here? What do they say about these type of encounters? Should it have escalated to this point? At this point, you've got an offender who's also a victim at this point. So, there's lots of things in this mix of discretion. All right, there are limits on discretion, and let's talk about some of them. There's departmental policy. If you go to Durham Police Department or Greensboro or Wilmington or Raleigh, there's going to be a book, departmental guidelines. And it's going to say, okay, here are the written policies for the department. Things you do, things you don't do, things you need approval, things you don't need approval for. A very good example of this, very specific, is high-speed pursuits. Because increasingly, high-speed pursuits will sometimes result in high liability for the police. So they chase someone, there's an accident, an innocent bystander is injured. Sometimes the cop is injured. Sometimes the person being chased is injured. And the police department gets sued. And the police, when they lose those types of cases, most of the time they win those cases because the hot pursuit was, or high-speed pursuit was justified. If they lose them, it could be quite expensive. Not just financially, but loss of life, an injury. So there is a policy in many, many police departments that a lower level policeman, if it was a department that had corporal or a master officer, if you were, say, in Raleigh, or private, they can't initiate and maintain a high-speed pursuit. They have to buck it up to the next level of command, be it a sergeant or a captain or lieutenant, and the lieutenant has to say, yes, you can go and chase him, or no, you can't. And they're going to look at a lot of factors here, like what time of day is it? Is school getting out? Do we want someone chasing a bad guy through a residential neighborhood at 90 miles an hour when kids are getting off school buses just for rolling through a stop sign? Now, if you're chasing a guy that just killed 47 people with a spoon, different story. The emphasis on de-escalation and use of force, which is, I think, really coming more and more into its own. What are the policies? How much force can be used? We're going to talk about a couple cases in a second. Remember, of course, that police organizations are a bureaucracy. They're structured as such, and they are typically structured almost exclusively as a pyramid, a hierarchy where you have a top, a small top, and a large bottom, so it's a pyramid. And in a military model, they have ranks. Now, having said that, there's informal rules in that pyramid, and there's formal rules in that pyramid and organization. So you have to understand each. Now, your book says one of the goals is to reach maximum efficiency. Well, I think that's debatable as to what you're measuring, and that they want to provide the best service they can with the limited resources. You do have to appreciate that any organization that you task with accomplishing any goal, there's a limit to how many people you have and how much money you can spend. And the police are no exception. So if you say, look, there's been a lot of murders in Raleigh, we want to really emphasize that, so we're going to assign more people to the homicide division. And we're going to let the homicide division spend more money. Well, there's a finite amount of money that the police have. So it might be, okay, we're going to take 10 people off of rape. We're going to rape cases. We're going to take 10 people off of burglary. We're going to take 10 people off of traffic. 10 people off of DUI. So yeah, you'll then have 40 or 50 more cops that can work murder cases, but you're going to have lower solve rates for some of the other crimes. It'd be great if there was an unlimited staff and unlimited budget. If you said, okay, we're just going to hire 50 more cops, or 100 more cops, or 200 more cops, and they're going to handle the murder cases. but no organization can afford to do that. All right. It is a chain of command structure. So we have a top, we have a chief of police, then we have lower ones. Usually there's seniors. I suppose it's a medium-sized police department. So a smaller city like Columbia, South Carolina, or um, Jackson, Mississippi, something like that. A medium-sized city. Not a large city like New York, but even a large city like New York is kind of like this. At the top, you're going to have the chief. Now, you'll often see chiefs of police when they're giving speeches, they're wearing stars on their collars, which, stars traditionally are reserved, by and large, for generals in the American Army. So you can think as the chief of police as a general. And then below him, you have typically, sometimes they're called majors, but these are his senior command officers. Below that, you're going to have captains and lieutenants, and those are kind of mid-level management. And below that, you're going to have really the backbone. This is called the line patrols. And this is going to be your master officers and sometimes your sergeants as well, and your regular police officers. Departments can also be organized by the area they're patrolling and the time of day. So you might have area 4 day patrol from this hour to this hour. Then you might have a night patrol from this hour to this hour. Those units that interact with the public typically are called field or line units. They patrol, they investigate, they conduct special operations. So the police, the typical thing we associate with the police is patrol, that they will be in their cars in America, driving around. Now that's a function of the structure of American society. We have large cities, but they're very spread out. You go to a city in Europe or Asia, they're very compact. So in Tokyo, yes, you've got police cars, but a lot of police officers spend a lot of their time on just regular foot patrol or in police boxes. So all police departments have patrol units, and it's usually the largest unit. So what's the purpose of them? Well, the stated purpose is you patrol to prevent crime, deter crime, to give the public a sense of security, and to give service. And I give a statistic there that somewhere between 7 and 10% of all contacts during this patrol is with people who have an addiction issue, and it could be most commonly alcohol, it could be drugs, or mental illness. So that's a significant thing they deal with now. So what are the 4 things they do on these patrols? Preventive patrol, most of the time that's what they're doing. That's their number one. They're going to be driving around. Sometimes they'll get a call to respond to service. Now remember, most of those the crimes already occurred. They're just going to show up afterwards. Administrative duties, paperwork, and then kind of investigation, officer-initiated investigation, sees something suspicious and goes to investigate it. That's the smallest part of what they do, even though I think that's very often portrayed in media and TV as the biggest thing they do. Detectives. As we move up the kind of chain, as we move up to the next level of the hierarchy from the very base patrol, we have detectives. And there's been hundreds of TV shows and movies about detectives. It's arguably the primary thing we portray. And they are the people in the police departments who investigate crimes. Usually they come up through the ranks. They were patrol officers. They don't spend most of their time tracking down serial killers or terrorists. Most of the time they're investigating property crimes, because most crimes that get reported are not these big dramatic events. They're the smaller crimes that constitute our everyday world. So obviously a lot of what a detective does is fairly unglamorous things, like investigating a robbery or burglary, which is not as exciting as doing tracking down a serial killer. There are some aggressive investigations strategies. The undercover work that you see or have heard about is not that common. More often, in order to investigate what goes on in a group or an organization, they're going to use people that are already in that organization and they're not police. These are confidential informants. And approximately 80% of the major, at least, illegal drug cases in the United States really are the result of confidential informants. And what can happen is that the police can catch someone and say, well, either you're going to go to jail or you're going to give us information about your dealer or who you deal with. And that, he becomes the confidential informant. The groups that do tend to have the most, I guess you could call them spying or preventive policing, tend to be groups that are viewed as capable of inflicting large-scale damage. Maybe they don't actually have that statistical probability. You know, drunk drivers kill a lot more people than terrorists. But we might think, well, a single terrorist could kill, say 9/11, thousands of people. Therefore, let's devote a lot of resources to combating terrorism and maybe not as many resources as combating drunk driving. Whereas, the probability of you dying because a terrorist kills you is pretty low. The probability of you dying because a drunk driver kills you is much higher. Now, these domestic terrorist groups are subject to very aggressive techniques, and this stretches all the way back. I was reading a book last night about a radicalized labor movement in the early 1900s, which still exists in a form. It's called the IWW, the International Workers of the World, or what was sometimes called the Wobblies. And they were so despised when the First World War broke out, and they opposed the First World War both in the United States and England, Australia, the English-speaking world, that they were viewed as just exceedingly dangerous, and they were infiltrated and broken up and killed, many of them. So how good are the police? How good a job do they do? Well, let's look at the two extremes. What we're gonna, if we're going to use a way to measure them, let's measure them. Do they clear a case? Not necessarily does someone get arrested and solved, but clearance rates are, you got a crime that's reported and there is an arrest, a prosecution, or the case is closed. So a quick example of a clearance. There might be a shooting. The cops chase the shooter, shoot and kill him. That case is going to be a homicide, and it's going to rate as clear, even though there's no arrest or investigation. So to return, if we take 2015 as a base year, before a lot of this craziness with COVID, and you can ignore some years. I mean, you can ignore 2001, 9/11, because if you think about it, there were 3,000 murders in one day, but you absolutely solved them all. So if you looked at the murder rate would go up, but the solve rate would go up because you had a 100% solve rate. We know who did it. Now, maybe not everybody that was behind it, but you knew the people that actually committed the murder. So if we look at a kind of a typical year, let's say 2015, the police in the United States solved about 62% of the homicides that were reported to them. And remember, first you have to determine that something's a homicide. If someone dies in a hospital because they didn't administer treatment because there was a DNR, that's not a homicide, but it could be classified as a homicide, but we decided not to. So first it gets decided it's a homicide, then it gets reported as a homicide to the police, then they investigate. So about 62% of homicides were solved, which really means that 40% roughly of all murders go unsolved, and 80%, 81, of property crimes go unsolved. So if someone steals your wallet, someone breaks into your house, someone steals your car, the odds of them being caught are not great. And most cases are solved very soon. Sometimes they call it the golden 48, or sometimes the golden week, golden month. It can be different things. But the longer a case remains unsolved, the lower the solve rates. So if a case is over a year's old, the probability of that case being solved drops sometimes 95%. Okay, so we do have tools to investigate, forensics, which is the application of scientific techniques or practices to investigation. It's not the sort of famous, I've got a gut feeling that Fred's the murderer. This is actually using science, and we're going to look at some of the tools, but it can let us know things like, why did someone die? What time did they die? Which would help you decide, is this guy possibly the murderer or not? What type of weapon was used? Who the victim is. Very often the victim will point you to the offender. Who the offender is. All these are valuable pieces of information. So there are different disciplines, and here is not an exhaustive list. Fingerprints, and you've all heard of this. And here at Wake Tech we teach advanced friction ridge analysis as one of our courses. It's not as perfect, again, as you see on TV, where they take a perfect fingerprint and compare it to another perfect fingerprint. They often transpose them on the screen and they match up exactly. Usually you don't have perfect fingerprints. You're comparing points on that to other points to give you a probability that they match. You've got ballistics. Now, every rifled gun, which could be a pistol or a rifle, has a barrel that has grooves cut in, and when the bullet comes out of the barrel of the gun, I'm trying to make it as simple as possible, the bullet is spinning, and as it's going down that barrel, the bullet is getting very minute cuts in it. And when that bullet is recovered, if you can find the barrel you think you came out of, you can match that bullet with that barrel. And if they match, you know stuff. Now, it's also things like, what is the caliber of the firearm, and different things, not just matching the groove marks on the bullet. Trace evidence, and we talked a little about fingerprints, but things like blood, hair, any biological marker that can help you identify. Electronic. You swim in an electronic sea. I say that in class all the time. When you pick up your cell phone and you use it, it's got a GPS in it. We know where you were when you made that call. We know when you made that call. When you go to the ATM, we know what time you showed up because there's a picture of you. It's on your receipt. There can be even more exotic things like entomology, believe it or not, bugs. If you find a body in the woods, one of the things that is done is the body is examined to see what bugs have colonized it, because there is a clear order in many cases about when certain bugs show up to basically eat a body. So certain flies or larvae will be in the body if the body's been there a week. Other ones will be in there a month. If you've got, certain fungi growing on it, it must have been there longer than that or shorter than that. Anthropology can be a field we look at. That involved the study of fingerprints. A whole number of fields exist. All right, now let's talk about one of the most famous, which is DNA. DNA, there were hints of it, but it really wasn't discovered, its structure as the double helix, until the 1960s by two men called Watson and Crick, who, by the way, built on work that was done by a woman, largely unacknowledged. But she had a big hand in it. But they basically discovered it in a sort of scientific way. And only slowly did it move from the labs in the 60s into policing. Because at first DNA tests, they weren't very good, they weren't very conclusive, they were very expensive. By the 1990s, they had gotten much better and the prices began to fall dramatically. And now, if you have a sample of someone, say blood or semen, skin, saliva sometimes, you can essentially take that to a lab and sequence it, which means you're going to look at the combination of the DNA. Everybody's DNA, which are these amino acids that are the building blocks of your cell, is unique. So if we can grow it in the lab and get a sample from you and compare it to your DNA, we can see if that sequence is the same, if the repeating numbers are the same, repeating amino acids. And there's basically only a few, but they repeat in millions of combinations. The match can be very conclusive. It can be a 30 billion to 1 probability that yes, we've got the right person, that these two match. And if DNA is present, it does increase the probability that a crime is going to be solved. Now, what does it have to say? Well, DNA is only as good as the database you can compare it to. We don't have everybody's DNA. If you've been in the service, if you've been arrested, if you volunteered, we have your DNA. But some people say, well, I don't want the government to have my DNA. So sometimes there's ways around having a sample. So if I go to like this new development here, just briefly, I'll talk about one of them, say familial searches. A number of people have been caught, which we didn't have their DNA. But believe it or not, a lot of these private firms like, Ancestry.com, you say, oh, provide us a DNA sample. Well, the police will go to them and they say, we have this DNA sample. We'd like to look at your database. And yeah, sure, here you go. And they can't find that person in the database, maybe. But what they can do is they can say, well, this person in the database has 25% of the same DNA as our suspect. Now, what that means is, quickly, if I have a brother and sister, they won't have identical DNA. Even identical twins don't, but much closer with twins. But a brother and sister share 50% of the same DNA. Okay, so if you have a stepbrother or a stepsister, okay, you're going to share 25% of the same DNA. Well, no, you'll share 50 there as well. I stand corrected. So we're looking at a cousin or something over. But basically, and I messed that up, I apologize. Basically, familial DNA searches say we've located the family line of just genetics. At the first level, it's 100%. The children have 50%. The grandchildren have 25% of the same DNA. And grandchildren are cousins to each other. All right, police strategy, what works? The operational basis of police force is incident driven. We react and we get there quickly when we get a call. And we very often measure response time, how fast people get there. So you'll hear a department say, well, our response time is less than 8 minutes. Our response time is less than 3 minutes. Well, that's great, but I hate to break it to you, and this is that perception reality, is that response time doesn't have a huge impact on crime rates. It has a fairly big impact on public satisfaction, but a strong argument can be made that it's not that related to solving crimes. So let's talk about this sort of mythology that surrounds police response time, police patrols. The core building block of police behavior, remember we said 40% of the time cops are driving around in their cars, is the patrol. And the idea of the patrol is if the cop's out there, people won't commit crimes. Well, in the 1970s, and I'm going to simplify this, in the 1970s they did a study. It was done in Kansas City. And bear with me a second here. What they do is you're going to take 3 parts of the city, Group A, Group B, Group C. And hopefully these areas are relatively similar, same crime rates, same demographics. So Group A is your control group. You're going to leave patrols there. Let's suppose there's 100 cops in them. Again, I'm making up a number here. We're going to leave 100 cops in there. They're still going to drive around. We'll look at the crime rate. Say we'll look at the murder and the burglary rate and the arson and the rape rate. And you're going to get a number. Let's suppose that number is 20 per 100,000. Group Area B, we're going to double the number of cops there. We're going to go from 100 cops to 200 cops. And then we're going to look at the murder, arrest, and burglary rates. And we'll get a number. Then we're going to go to C. We're going to pull all the cops off the street. They're going to respond, but they're not going to drive around. We're going to stop patrolling. Now the expectation was, well, patrols lower crime. However, the results were, no, they don't. Having the police officers drive around, randomly in particular, it really has no impact on crime. One guy looking at the study said, having the cops drive around looking for crime makes as much sense as having firemen drive around looking for fires. It's better to respond to a fire when it's called, right, than to be, waste the time, the gas, dressed up in a uniform, driving around looking for fires. Now, directed patrols are a little different, but the randomized patrol really it has undergone a lot of criticism. So smarter policing is identifying areas where there's high crime and putting your resources there. And one of the ways we've done this is we've developed, CompStat is a good application of this, but we've developed computerized mapping of crime. So people will study areas and they'll say, okay, do we need a lot of police here? Okay, when does crime occur there? Well, crime occurs between, say, 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. Great, that's the time we need more cops there. Faster response times, maybe faster solve rates at least. But there's not a lot of crime between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Okay, we can put resources somewhere else. So, who to arrest? Reactive arrests basically means the police wait for a crime to occur and they go out and arrest. Proactive arrest says you go out looking for someone, a particular type of criminal, and you're trying to prevent sometimes a more serious crime by catching them for a more minor crime. And this goes to the broken window theory. You deal with small things before they grow into big things. The problem with this is, and again, it was seen as an improvement. It was seen of integrating the police into the community. The problem is it was also seen as very intrusive by the police, and it became an excuse for the police, seen as an excuse, to interfere at very basic levels. It was developed in the 80s, and it had mixed evaluations. Lately, the idea of this zero tolerance, where you deal with the small crimes before they grow into big ones, really been challenged. Let me give you a quick example. A few years back, there was during President Trump, the Attorney General of the United States talked about marijuana use a little bit. Now, his name was Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, former senator from Alabama, Attorney General of the United States. He believed that smoking marijuana led to more drugs. This is what's called the gateway drug theory, that if you do one drug, that will lead you to another. Interesting theory, and you could see that applying the broken window theory to this, it's inevitable. You catch someone smoking dope, you arrest them so that they don't go on and use crack. Okay, well, the problem with the gateway theory drug, and Jefferson Beauregard Sessions' theory about the gateway drug, and it's been around for a long time, this theory, is not a lot of evidence to support it. There's not a lot of evidence to say that there's a gradation of drugs. It's not like we say, okay, if you drink alcohol, you'll smoke a joint. If you smoke a joint, you'll use amphetamines. You use amphetamines, you'll use crack. You use crack, you'll use meth. You use meth, you use opiates. Sometimes people will never smoke marijuana and will wind up using opioids. Some people will only abuse alcohol. Some people will only abuse marijuana. There's really a danger here that this zero tolerance can be based on things like bad science. All right, so community policing is the philosophy that emphasizes community support for and cooperation with the police in return for preventing crime. And the police, remember going way back to Sir Robert Peel's The Public of the Police of the Public, you want to create relationships with local leaders. You want to be involved in the community. You want to be proactively solving. Now, this has some really good parts. It could have some bad parts. It could be viewed as intrusive. But one of the good parts is if there's ever a problem in your community with the police. But if the police have shown up at the county fairs and helped raise money for the school band and really been integrated into the community, and I just gave those two examples quickly, then if there's a problem, the police are not seen as the outsiders. To go back to what I talked about in a couple previous chapters, when the Indianapolis Police Department went to the LGBT community and asked for cooperation to track BTK, if the Indianapolis Police Department had always been tolerant, and that's admittedly somewhat of an offensive word, but if they'd always just been tolerant of homosexual behavior, or if they had, said, well, we're not interested in policing this. We're going to exercise discretion not to arrest people for consensual sexual activity between adults. Then when the police showed up, they would have had this goodwill in the bank. It would have been, well, yeah, we can trust the cops. This guy acted suspicious. That goodwill helps you solve crimes. Problem-oriented policing is really a step back. This says, let's develop strategies that identify criminal activity, how it develops, how to respond, and controlling its root behavior. And it really encourages officers to just stop dealing with the day-to-day, stop dealing with the results of the process, and look at the process itself. So it can be something seemingly innocuous. So, famously, a number of experiments were done with midnight basketball leagues. So these were primarily urban experiments, but they seem to work fairly well in some cases. You got a high crime rate because you've got juveniles, and remember, most juvenile street crime is going to be committed by males, and mostly relatively young, starting in the teens and working up to their 20s. So what the police did in some areas is they started basketball leagues and sports for, particularly in summertime, for teens to have something to do with the police, believe it or not. These were police sponsored, and there was basketball and there was activities, and it could not just be basketball. It could be, outward bound, could be camping, could be, you name it. And what you're seeking to do by doing something seemingly as unrelated to policing as setting up a basketball league to give the youth something to do is you're lowering crime. And you might say, well, it seems so far out of the police's job. Well, this is dealing with the problem, not the result. Now, the us versus them. You do have to understand that to some extent, and I've seen this among the cops I know, that the police subculture isolates them from larger society. There is a culture of policing. The police have been socialized. They have become not black, not white, not male, not woman, not Latino, not Anglo, but they bleed blue. And this is a socialization process where they become police officers. They attend an academy. They work with an FTO or a senior officer. They make a felony arrest. They use force. They see force being used. They see traumatic incidences. And now, who do they talk to? Who do they identify with? Other cops. And this leads to very much an insular attitude. That Robert Peel, the public of the police and the police of the public, not so much. All right, the dangers of being police officers, they do come in contact with people 40 million times a year. But there are relative, this is not to say that police officers aren't injured and died. My cousin's husband was chief of police in a small town. He was killed. So I take this very seriously, and I don't want to de-emphasize it. But comparatively, there are low rates of death and injuries in police work as opposed to some other occupations. But it is stressful. We do see high rates of burnout. We see high rates of PTSD. Police officers do use force. Now, it is rare. It only occurs in about 1.5% of public encounters. So 99 times out of 100, the police don't have to use force. And when they do, it's very low-level force at first. Sometimes it can be command present, an order given with the implicit threat of force. Generally, we want force to be reasonable, proportional to what it's faced. And deadly force should be rare. Force when the person is likely to be killed or suffer significant injury. The Supreme Court of the United States has placed a couple big limits. Now we're going to talk more about Tennessee versus Garner than Graham versus Connor. And again, if you take our con law course, we'll spend a lot more time on Graham versus Connor and certainly a lot of time on Tennessee versus Garner. But quickly, I'll give you the rundown in Tennessee versus Garner. This case was you had someone running away from police who'd committed a robbery. A police officer said, I knew he wasn't armed, but he just committed a felony theft. I think he was climbing over a fence. He was about to escape, so I shot him. I killed him. And it goes up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and they said, you can't do it. You can only use deadly force, and a firearm is always per se, which means automatically deadly force, if there is a threat of death of the officer or a bystander or serious physical injury. You can't use it for property. And the Graham versus Connor is more stepping down from deadly force. It looks at all force and says, okay, what is the correct proportional amount of force that a reasonable man would say was okay, and a reasonable man would say beyond this it's excessive. It's an interesting case. It's a North Carolina case. All right, in a democratic society, the police are expected to be professionals, adhering to a standard and to high moral characters. And if they lose the respect of the public, if they become unpopular, if they become unloved or unwanted, it is difficult for them to do their job. And one of the things that's true is if the police abuse their power, if they become corrupt, they lose public support if it's perceived. So why does corruption occur? Well, corruption can occur in different ways. It can be for personal gain. I want you to, not write me that ticket, officer. Here's $100. Okay, that's bribery. It can be shakedown. This is aggressive. Sometimes this is called meat eating. Bribery, if it's given, not asked for, sometimes you call that grass eaters. When you go out and seek it, that's called meat eating. So you go to somebody and you say, hey, if you want me to show up if you file a robbery report, better give me $100. Mooching is accepting free gifts, and it lies somewhere in between. So why do police become corrupt? Well, sometimes they become corrupt for good reasons. They catch someone. This guy knows where a kidnapped little girl is. He's not talking. The police, and the police have been known to do this, they torture a confession out of him. That's not for the benefit of anybody else but that little girl, but that's still corruption. It's still wrong. And the problem there is, you may get the guy who kidnapped the little girl, but what happens if it's not the guy that kidnapped the little girl and you tortured him? Sometimes people do it because they have no morality. They simply seek to accomplish their goal no matter what. Now, here is part of the problem is, and this goes back to the ancient Romans, quaes custodius custodias. It's a question asked by the Romans 2,000 years ago, which basically translates as, who guards the guards? How do you keep an eye on the people keeping an eye on us? Now, typically what we've done is we've said, let the police look after themselves. They set up internal affair units, and they keep an eye on themselves. They investigate themselves. Or let the DAs do it. Of course, the DAs work hand in glove with the police. They rely upon the police for their cases. They very often have control and closer. So the old expression is, you're letting the fox guard the henhouse. Sometimes there's civilian oversight boards and committees. These are not very effective, and typically these are fought tooth and nail by the police and by district attorneys. They think civilians aren't really qualified to look over them. They don't like the second guessing that's going on. There's citizen surveillance, which I think the rise of cell phones recording this has really exposed that a lot of corruption and a lot of violence conducted by the police that had been reported in the past but really not believed. Now we have physical evidence of it. So they can, although it's rare, be charged. More often what happens with the police is, since you can't get them to charge themselves, or you can't get the DA to charge them, they're sued. Now you can sue either federally, and that's usually under 42 U.S.C. 1983, called the Anti-Ku Klux Klan Act of 1877 or 1867. Or you can sue under the State Tort Claim Act in North Carolina, say. But be aware that the police win the vast bulk of these lawsuits. Because a lot of times, I was robbing a liquor store and a cop hurt me. Well, too damn bad. But a lot of the time, hey, I was walking down the street and a cop tackled me and he had the wrong guy. Well, yeah, that is bad. We're going to deal with it. All right, a little bit about bias. Is there bias in policing? And I think you can, looking at the data, not come to any conclusion. But yes, there's bias going on. Statistically, the police are 3.5 times more likely to use force against black suspects than whites. They're 3 times more likely to stop a vehicle if it's a Latino or a black driving it. Now, where this exactly comes from is where we get into more of an issue. I also would like to posit one thing. If I put a statistic up there that said you are 10 times more likely to be assaulted if you are a male than a female by the police, you'd say, oh, well, yeah, but men are capable of physical resisting. There's an actual difference. That's an explanation that isn't necessarily a prejudice. It is a bias, but it's a bias based on fact. So you've got to examine these numbers and ask certain questions behind them. Don't just take them as rote information. Ask, okay, well, why? Why are more black suspects being abused? Why are more black violence being committed? Very often what happens is police departments overall get sued, and sometimes the courts get involved and they will set up and compel changes like training. These are civil rights violations, and I'm going a little bit over, so I'm going to wrap this up as fast as I can. Ethics is basically, officers are going to face these moral dilemmas, and the question is going to be, what's the right thing to do? What do you do when it's difficult to do what's right? And what do you do when whatever you're going to do, if it's bad, actually helps more people than hurts them? Ethics are very often, it's easy to be ethical in an easy moral situation. Oh, someone is, killing and raping small children, and he's got a knife and he's coming at me, and if he gets past me, he's going to kill and rape more children. Well, it's not a difficult ethical decision to use force against that individual. But ethical problems occur when there's a conflict between different duties or different aspects of good ethical behavior. If you've got a suspect that if you answer a question honestly and you really believe he committed a crime, he's going to get away, do you do your duty to get a violent person off the street, or do you tell the absolute truth? What about if a good fellow officer had a bad day and he did something terrible or did something bad, and if it gets out, he's going to lose his job and the police department's going to lose a good cop? There's a conflict between honesty and loyalty. And then there's a conflict between loyalty and duty. So ethical problems usually are not simple. They're clashes between different important ideas. Okay, I want to ask this question here towards the end. Can you even teach ethics? I was listening to a debate online between a Christian and an atheist. And the Christian said, you can't be a good person, to the atheist. Because you don't believe in God. Your ethical standards are all internal. Your morality is all internal, and it can change. And if you didn't believe in God, why? You can act outrageously. And that's a legitimate point of view. That's you're saying, okay, then all morality and all ethical behavior is completely subjective to the individual. But the atheist came back and said, well, wait a minute. What you're saying is that if you didn't have God telling you not to rape and kill and snort crack, that you do that. And the Christian said, no, I wouldn't do it. And the atheist said, exactly, I won't do it either. We're both not doing it. You believe in God, I don't believe in God, so is God making you do it? In other words, and this is a bit of a stretch, does an external thing like teaching people get them to be ethical? Or is there some sort of internal mechanism that can't necessarily be taught that's giving rise to all this? And I think these are really legitimate questions that have to be answered. All right, and on that, a little bit longer than I like to keep it 45, and I know we're at 54. But have a good day, and when you're ready, Chapter 7 will be